Now, Tonight with Andrew Marr.
Good evening. How bad is it? I mean, this business of the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, allegedly lying about the deficit. Somebody has to resign over this budget, and this afternoon, somebody did. But it wasn't a politician, it was the chair of the OBR, the Organisation of Budget Responsibility, Richard Hughes, who did the decent thing and went over that embarrassing leak. The politicians, meanwhile, are hanging tough. The essence of the accusation against the Chancellor is that she decided on a traditional tax and spend Labour budget because that's what her backbenchers wanted. To do that, she used warnings of a huge fiscal black hole in the budget books as cover. Problem? The OBR published all its workings, which showed that the black hole was much shallower and less black than she had suggested. In other words, the substantial income tax rises everybody will face in the next 2 to 3 years were more of a political choice than the necessity she claimed. That matters because it makes everybody even angrier. One cabinet minister told me he thought that the budget had gone badly wrong and that, however passionately the Chancellor felt she hadn't lied, any Treasury response, which was too complicated and difficult for ordinary folk to follow, simply would not work. Here's Keir Starmer putting the best gloss on it he could this morning.
There was a point at which we thought, myself included, that we might have to reach for a manifesto breach of some significance. I didn't want to get to that place, but I recognise we might have to. As the process then continued, it became clear to me and others that we might be able to do what we needed to do with our priorities without that manifesto breach. And that's what we did with the fair and necessary decisions that we took.
Both the Conservatives and Reform are now calling for Reeves to resign or be sacked. Privately, many Labour MPs, including ministers, think the jig is pretty much up for both the Chancellor and the Prime Minister. Muttering is mutating into plotting. Now, this is clearly a dangerous game because it could plunge the governing party into near anarchy and therefore the country into chaos, for which we'd all pay an even higher borrowing cost. Everything is fragile. So everybody needs to move delicately. Trouble is, Keir Starmer is now so unpopular in the country, and he and his Chancellor have lost so much authority, which is a commodity it's hard to get back, that some kind of change seems highly likely. Part of the story is Scotland. If the unpopularity of the UK government means Labour gets a belting in May's Scottish parliamentary elections and the SNP romp in again, it may be hard to avoid another independence referendum. So let's talk now to the Secretary of State for Scotland, Douglas Alexander. Douglas, how well is it going just now?
Well, if you ask me 3 or 4 days after we've announced the lifting of 450,000 kids out of poverty, I'd say that's a pretty successful initiative. If you say, should we be acting to cut energy bills by £150, I would certainly welcome that. And as Scottish Secretary, the fact that we committed an extra £820 million to backing Scottish public services last week is certainly welcome news. Of course there are noises off. Of course there is briefings here and there. That's politics. But what matters, I would argue, to people's lives, not just in Scotland but across the UK, are those kind of measures that tackle the cost of living crisis, back our public services, and make sure that we're lifting kids out of poverty.
Did you know ahead of the budget that the black hole wasn't 30 or 20 billion pounds, but almost nothing at all?
Well, there's quite let me talk to you about what I know.
Question. Did you know?
Let me tell you what I did know. First of all, on the first cabinet meeting that I attended after 15 years, when I was appointed in September, Rachel Reeves led off a discussion about the context for the budget and generally about economic growth. I then had a series of conversations bilaterally with Rachel and with other Treasury ministers, both about the budget and naturally how I could deliver for Scotland. And then we had the formal process on the morning of the budget, as you always do. I would simply say, Andrew, you know that this is not the first cabinet I've served in. The level of engagement and information that I had from the Treasury easily bears comparison with when Gordon Brown was the Chancellor or indeed when Alistair Darling was the Chancellor.
You're an honest man. You can't answer the question, did you know about the scale of the deficit? Because you did not know.
No, let me be honest. The scorecard is and always has been held by the Treasury because, frankly, the Treasury has to be in a position...
So you were surprised by what you heard from the OBR?
No, forgive me. Let me finish the point. The Treasury has to be in a position to be able to hold the overall numbers in the spreadsheet. That is not unprecedented that the spreadsheet is not in every juncture being shared with the Cabinet. Every Cabinet of which I have been part has not been in a position where every budget forecast, and remember under the OBR we have 5 forecasts in the months immediately preceding the budget, the numbers go back and forth. It's perfectly reasonable for that information, in this case, to be held by the Chancellor and indeed by the Prime Minister.
Let's remind people of why this really matters, which is that these very substantial tax rises that are going to come just ahead of the general election, 2 to 3 years, everybody's going to feel them. We were told was essential because of the level of the black hole. It wasn't a political choice. It wasn't something anyone wanted to do.
You need to be very careful and precise in your language. If you, for example, talk about the speech that Rachel gave on the 4th of November, could you point me to where she uses the words black hole in that speech?
She doesn't use the words black hole, but she says she talks about...
So the allegation that is level... the entire question is premised on the black hole. She literally didn't say it.
I can tell you, I was briefed by the Treasury about there being first a £30 billion black hole and then a £20 billion black hole. I've had that from the Treasury, and virtually every other journalist who's covered this story has had the same experience.
And I'm not questioning your integrity. I'm saying when people say Rachel was guilty in that speech of describing a black hole, I simply say look at the words on the page. I can't speak to the briefing that you had or indeed other journalists have, and I understand the importance of being able to rely on what you're told by advisors or officials or whoever else. I would simply say we need to be clear and precise, because when I listened to some people suggesting that she was talking about a black hole in that speech, I've reread that speech naturally in preparing for this interview, and most of what she said in that speech actually was borne out in terms of the subsequent choices that were made in the budget.
Well, let me talk about choices, because I think the political issue here is when people pay higher taxes, they may be prepared to pay higher taxes, not happy about it, but prepared to do it if they feel that the fiscal challenge or crisis facing the country is such that there are no alternatives. But there were alternatives. These tax rises did not have to happen. In terms of the way the Treasury presented the condition of the economy ahead of time.
So firstly, it's an observable fact that £16 billion was not available that we thought might have been as a result of the productivity revision reflecting the period of the last Conservative government. And Keir Starmer has been clear today that he is, I'm not quite sure what was it, bemused was the word he used, that this happened 16 months into Labour government. Be that as it may, he then was very clear saying if you've got £16 billion less than you were anticipating as a result of a productivity revision, that materially affects the numbers. The second charge that is laid against us as a government is that, if you like, there was a surplus of £4 billion. In fact, what the OBR numbers that people are focusing on reflect is that there was £4 billion of unallocated money at the back end of the Parliament in 2030. You and I both know that one of the central challenges of this budget was actually to increase the headroom. The headroom at the last budget was £9 billion. So those who say that there was, if you like, a no change choice available to Rachel Reeves, I simply don't accept. I do accept she exercised her judgment.
What do you say to Cabinet colleagues who are saying that they did not know about this discrepancy and they're very upset about it, and they're upset about the way the budget is landing?
Well, firstly, I don't think it's a good look to anonymously brief journalists. That's your stock in trade, and I understand you welcome that. As a Cabinet colleague, I don't think it makes sense. I think it is a sign that they don't recognise their responsibilities. And frankly, in the Cabinet, you have the opportunity to put forward your point of view, but you should respect Cabinet confidentiality. But secondly, it doesn't reflect the reality of the conversations of which I was part, both bilaterally with ministers in the Treasury and indeed the character of the conversations we had around the table.
I said earlier on that I thought that the manoeuvring, the plotting, which certainly has begun, is a very, very dangerous game. In other words, there's a danger now of destabilising the Labour Party in power and causing a period of political chaos, which we would all pay for with even higher borrowing costs. Do you agree with that?
I don't really want to add much petrol to the flames. I'm more of the kind of Harold Wilson, I tell you what's going on, we're going on, school of mind. Frankly, to add more comments and more words to what's happening or not happening, frankly, the important responsibility, I think, as far as the public are concerned, is that ministers spend less time briefing respected journalists and more time doing their jobs.
Very good. In Scotland, you have a very, very good leader in Anas Sarwar, and yourself, of course. You've got a very, very well-funded party up there, a great ground campaign, and a lot of confidence inside the party. But something, if you look at the polls, is going wrong. What is going wrong?
That essentially the SNP have a low ceiling but high floor. About 30%, 32% of Scottish people for 40 years have seen politics through the lens of identity rather than delivery. So that 32% or so are pretty impervious to whether you can't build a ferry, your educational standards are falling, not rising, or you can't get waiting lists down. Our challenge is to take our numbers back to where we were in July of 2024. In July of 2024, as the Scottish Labour Party, we recorded the highest vote share of any part of Great Britain. Okay. And in that sense, what we need to do is to focus people's minds and say, with great respect, how you feel about Keir Starmer, how you feel about Rachel Reeves, how you feel about Douglas Alexander is irrelevant to the choice that you are making.
Very interesting you put it that way.
Because the election is a choice of First Minister, not of Prime Minister. And in a head-to-head contest between Anas Sarwar, for all the reasons you describe, and John Swinney, I'm pretty confident there's a path to victory.
Well, it's very interesting you put it that way. How popular is Keir Starmer on the doorstep in Scotland?
Truthfully, the numbers are not good for any of us.
Unpopular.
Because ultimately I think people voted for us in July of 2024 in the expectation of immediate change. That's why I really welcome the £150 off energy bills this week. It's incidentally why I welcome the fact we'll lift 24,000 families out of poverty. But the reality is, it's a classic issue of political framing. Will the election next May in Scotland be a referendum on 18 months of a Labour government trying to undo the damage of the last 14 years of the Conservatives, or on 18 years of the SNP? And I genuinely believe that is a contest. Anas, who you've spoken warmly and generously of, he's an extraordinarily talented politician, said to me recently, he said, elections are a bit like World Cups. You think about the last one until you're into the next one. Delighted to say Scotland is into the next one now, having qualified. That's another opportunity to blow our horn in terms of the success of the Scotland football team. But the reality is, for the time being, the reason those numbers have not shifted is because people are looking backwards rather than forwards. And my sense is, partly given the significance of the Scottish elections, partly given the fact that the SNP are a tired government that genuinely deserve to lose, the focus in Scotland will shift towards the spring of next year into recognising this is not a choice about who's in Downing Street, it's a choice about who's in Bute House.
If, despite all your best hopes and efforts, it doesn't go so well in May and the SNP come back again, they've said this would allow them the chance of another referendum. Now, I know the legal position, but is the Labour Party down in London really strong enough to stop that happening if you've just been scalloped by them in Scotland?
So, to follow the footballing analogy, I'm not going to... Scalloped would be something completely different. Although we've got a great seafood industry in Scotland, I'm obliged to say that as Scottish Secretary. But the reality is, to follow the footballing analogy, I'm not going to engage in a post-match analysis before a ball's been kicked. And the truth is, rather than anticipate defeat and, if you like, indulge in the SNP's core vote strategy of talking about independence, I'd rather spend, as I'm doing, every waking hour trying to make sure Anas Sarwar is First Minister next May.
All right, Douglas Alexander, thank you very much indeed for coming in. Now, our political correspondent, Aggie Chambre, is here with me as well. Aggie, straightforward question. How much trouble are the Chancellor and the Prime Minister in on the Labour benches?
I think they're in quite a lot of trouble, Andrew. I think they were in trouble before the budget, and actually the budget for about 24 hours helped them, as it was commented on by many people, including us. It felt like a budget for the political Labour Party, the Parliamentary Labour Party.
Everybody was pleased about the two-child cap being lifted.
Everyone was absolutely delighted. This is something Labour MPs had absolutely been crying out for. But then the OBR published that letter on Friday that showed that actually the forecasts were not as dire as Rachel Reeves had made out. And she talked a lot about the productivity downgrade, and she had not talked about the fact that that was actually offset by real wages and inflation, which I think has upset Labour MPs. So I think people talked about the fact that they had bought themselves more time. The Prime Minister had bought himself more time after that budget. And I think now people are worried again. Someone said to me today in government that they watched the Prime Minister's press conference, and when he had to say again and again and again, I did not mislead the public, or words to that effect, they said it wasn't a good look, and it felt a little bit like the Boris Johnson era. That should not be what he was talking about, when he should be talking about the pride he had in the budget.
Douglas Alexander gave a very eloquent exposition just now of why she had not misled people. But the charge is still there that the country got one impression and the budget produced something different.
Indeed, and I completely appreciate what Douglas Alexander said, which is that she did not talk about the black hole. There were briefings about a black hole, 20 to 30 billion pounds, and she did talk about the productivity downgrade, and she didn't talk about the fact that that was offset, and I think that is upsetting people because she was telling the truth, but I don't think she was telling the whole truth about that. And then there was also the fact that, and Keir Starmer said today, we were considering breaching our manifesto pledge with income tax. That's something we decided not to do. After the Financial Times reported that they were not going to do that, then there were briefings then. That was because the forecasts were better than expected. We now know the forecast did not change between those periods, so that has upset people too.
What changed was that Number 10 was so horrified as they thought about it, about breaking the manifesto pledge on income tax rates, that they leaked it. That's what the Treasury thinks.
And there was reporting over the weekend that actually they did private polling as well and saw that the public would just simply not accept this. So instead they did this smorgasbord of tax rises, and we are seeing how that's going down.
Not enormously well so far, but maybe it'll change soon. Anyway, we'll find out more about exactly what happened with that huge OBR leak next, with the man who was charged with investigating what led to the technical fault. You're listening to Tonight with Andrew Marr. Time now, 6:17.
Ciaran.
6:19. Last week's leaking of virtually all the budget secrets before the Chancellor stood up was one of the most sensational foul-ups in recent political history. Already a speedy investigation has taken place, and the findings suggest cock-up, not conspiracy, a mistake, not a deliberate attempt to sabotage Rachel Reeves's big day. Ciaran Martin, the former head of the National Cyber Security Centre, was one of those on the case, and he joins me now. Ciaran, it's very good to have you on the show. Just let me check that I'm right about that. No conspiracies here, nobody doing something egregiously stupid, and no malice.
So no conspiracy, no hostile activity that we know of, no foreign interference, cyber attacks, cyber crime. The issue was that when the OBR pre-uploaded the economic and fiscal outlook statement, which accompanies the budget, they assumed that it was hidden from public access because they thought that the service they were using, WordPress, essentially did that automatically. They were using a feature which bypassed the security that makes it private, and they didn't know that that feature, that service had that effect, which meant that essentially all the protections they thought they were using were redundant. And what that meant was that anybody who knew the address, and the address was guessable because it followed a set format, in a sense, as is well known, it's been established since last Wednesday. If you replaced March with November from the last internet address, the last URL, it would work for those 38 minutes.
So it's not as simple as somebody pressing send by mistake, as you say in the report. This is a software glitch, which could, I think, have gone back for many years, or some years at any rate.
Yeah, I think it will be very hard to tell definitively how far back it went. There are 2 points here. First is that we know from our investigative work that the OBR's publication procedures haven't changed very much for the most recent fiscal events, and therefore that you can surmise that the weaknesses that gave the access that was apparent last Wednesday could have been there in previous fiscal events. And we know for a fact that at least one IP address, one internet user accessed it last March, accessed the spring statement of the last fiscal event last March. We don't know who that was or what happened with it, but we know there was at least one access. So the weakness was definitely there last March, and possibly beforehand. We don't know.
So to use technical language, there was something wrong deep in the gubbins of the system. It seems to me that it's impossible, really, for the head of the OBR, Mr. Hughes, to have known anything at all about this, and therefore I am completely surprised and puzzled by why he would resign over something like this.
Well, I can't comment on why he took the decision to resign, and clearly there are all sorts of discussions about the relationship between the government and the OBR, and this investigation is. It's just
reading your report carefully, it seems to virtually exonerate him.
What I think the root cause, if you like, in terms of the systemic aspect of this, Andrew, is that It goes back as far as 2013, when the OBR is in its infancy.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
.gov.uk, but .gov.uk comes along, which is a big centralisation of the government's internet presence. And the OBR says we need to be out of this to prove our independence. Now, there are all sorts of other independent bodies that took a different decision, and they said, look, we'll let the government host it as long as we've got the freedom to publish what we want when we want, right? So the OBR decided to go its own way. The problem with that is that the government, for all its faults, and I worked in government for many years, so I know it's not far from perfect, is a £1 trillion organisation. The OBR is a small business, and it's got a publishing capability that runs like a small business, and it's not fit for something of the magnitude of the budget secrets.
So that's absolutely true. All I'm saying is it goes back way, way beyond Richard Hughes taking over to the origins of the OBR, really, and therefore I still can't understand at all why he would resign.
Well, again, it's not something I can particularly comment on. I think there is a point which goes into the tenure of everybody involved about checking things and so forth, and there's an object lesson here for all sorts of people charged with online publishing about the dangers of it.
Sure. Ciaran Martin, thank you very much indeed for that. Let's return now to the hot water the Prime Minister and Chancellor may find themselves in. What is the mood amongst their backbenchers? Graham Stringer is the Labour MP for Blakely and Middleton South. Graham, very good to have you on the show. How do you feel about the way the budget is landing?
I think I thought the preparation for the budget was chaotic and appalling. You've been about a long time, I've been about a long time, and I can't think of any precedent for the shambles that there was in the run-up to the budget, ending in for the first time ever, the Chancellor standing up to make the budget statement when everybody knew what it was. The budget itself, I think the mood amongst Labour MPs is some people see it as a breach of a manifesto commitment not to raise taxes, but they're also relieved that it's not a fundamental increase in the rate of taxation. And there are some good things in it that Labour MPs appreciate and some poor things. There's no mention of growth. So there's really mixed feelings about the landing of the budget itself.
And what about today's allegation the Treasury misled the country about the nature of the economic plight we were in?
I think that the Chancellor, when she made her speech in November at breakfast time, didn't tell direct lies as much as I can see it as opposed to not informing the country.
So it wasn't the whole truth, in other words.
It was a sin of omission, not commission, and it's still a sin.
Still a sin. And as we've just been hearing, the head of the OBR went for something which seems much, much less his fault than anything else, and the Chancellor is still there. Do you think that's fair?
I can't think of any other Chancellor who had presided over the chaos before, with the icing on the cake, in a sense, being the budget being released before she stood up to speak, surviving. I think that the Parliamentary Labour Party are waiting before there is any attempt to change the situation until the local elections in May and the elections in Wales and Scotland. So I think MPs are holding their breath and hoping. But if the opinion polls prove to be right, and then I think there will be a real assessment of both the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Do you think that they should go if things don't improve?
I think that's a decision for the Parliamentary Labour Party. I mean, I know that's avoiding...
Of which you're part of it, of course. So.
Yeah, I know that's avoiding the question. I think that if the elections are as bad as they are, and if there is no improvement in the basically the day-to-day business of government as well as the medium-term assessment, I can't see how they can stay. I mean, this government entered office with high hopes from virtually every Labour MP, and those hopes have been dashed. We're coming up to a critical point in May. We'll be nearly halfway through this Parliament, and things haven't improved. They've gradually got worse since the first financial statement made by the Chancellor, which was a disaster. So I think if things aren't turned around by May, then I would vote for a change.
Very, very interesting indeed. Graham Stringer, thanks so much for that. Now let's turn to the polling in various different ways, because it's more complicated perhaps than the last conversations might have suggested, including for Reform UK. I'm joined now by Luke Tryl, director of the polling company More in Common. Luke, great to have you on the show. Let's talk first and foremost about Reform, because, you know, for weeks and months we've been saying Reform's getting even further ahead in the polls. Reform, Reform, Reform. And suddenly things seem to be changing.
Yes, it does seem that Reform have hit what we sometimes call a plateau in polling terms. We've been used to, every time we spoke, Andrew, almost, Reform having a higher poll lead, their vote share going up. It does seem now that they've hit kind of 30% and are somewhat stuck around
and some of the polls are showing them falling as well.
Exactly. In fact, most of the polls that came out last week showed Reform dipping, not hugely, but by 1, 2, 3 points, and that is a change from what we've been used to seeing. And I think there are probably a couple of factors at play there. Perhaps the most prominent one, the most important one, is that when the focus is on the economy, when it's on fiscal issues, as it is in the run-up to the budget, as opposed to immigration or crime, where Reform is stronger, it's harder for Reform to get into the conversation.
And that might matter more than the highly publicised attack on Nigel Farage for things he said when he was at school.
I suspect that is likely to be shaping things more. Of course, everything sort of adds up. It's that sort of Tesco mantra about everything adding up in a certain way. So I no doubt that will play a role. For some, it might be the Nathan Gill trial and the revelations about his relationship with Russia as well. These things come together. But I do think the larger factor is likely to be
economics,
that focus on economy.
Let me ask you about the budget. We've just been talking about it and the way it's fallen. We've talked about politicians, we've talked about MPs and ministers. How is it going down with the public?
Not particularly well, it is fair to say. So if you look across different pollsters, most pollsters have recorded a negative verdict. If there is a silver lining, it's in our polling, we find that at least people tend to say it was neither better nor worse than expected. So if there was an upside from all of that pre-briefing, it's that people were primed for it not to be that great. But I think the thing that will worry the government the most is, going into this budget, the key test that the public set was, will it help with the cost of living? And in our polling that we did after the budget, just 6% of the public thought that this budget would help with the cost of living. So on that key test, it hasn't convinced the public yet. Maybe that will change when they start to feel the effects.
And a doughty defence and optimism from the Douglas Alexander, the Scottish Secretary, earlier on about Labour in Scotland. What are the polls showing there at the moment?
Well, you remember that in the last set of Scottish elections, Labour got a historically poor result. It was their worst result since 1910. If you look at the polling today, they're actually polling on the constituency vote some 4 or 5 points below that. Now, the SNP are down too, but because the unionist vote is even more split with the entry of Reform UK, what you could see is the SNP actually increasing, or actually getting a majority, even on a much lower vote share, and Labour heading to 17-18% of the vote.
Well, that would be sensational. Luke Tryl, thank you very much indeed for talking to me. Now, up next, we're going to hear from Lady Cherie Blair, the renowned human rights lawyer and former resident, of course, of number 10 Downing Street, after the Labour MP Tulip Sadiq was sentenced to 2 years in prison by a corruption trial in Bangladesh. First, time now 6:32, and Amelia Cox has your news headlines.
Andrew Marr. Listen on your smart speaker. Just say, play LBC.
6:34. The Labour MP and former Minister Tulip Sadiq has been jailed in absentia for 2 years by a Bangladeshi court in a corruption case involving her aunt, the former ruler of Bangladesh, Sheikh Hussein. But many lawyers think this is a gross injustice, and one of them is Cherie Blair. Now, back practicing at the bar after those long years in Number 10, she joined me earlier on, and she told me what she thinks the problem is with this case and the conviction of Sadiq.
Well, the problem is that she has not had a fair trial. The problem is she's been adjudicated as a fugitive in her absence. The problem is she has not had any legal representation in these proceedings. And despite the efforts of her solicitors here in London to both notify the authorities that she's here and is ready to answer the claims against her and asking for details of those claims against her, the Bangladesh authorities have singularly failed to give her a single piece of evidence so that she could, even if she wanted to, respond. And indeed have gone further and intimidated the Bangladeshi lawyer that was prepared to represent her, so he withdrew from representing her.
Isn't the problem that she wouldn't or couldn't go to Bangladesh, where she could have been arrested and actually put in jail had she been there, and that therefore she was bound to be tried in absentia? And the courts say they have got lots of records and email trails and WhatsApp messages and the rest of it, which show that she was trying to influence Sheikh Hasina's government.
Well, I think that if you notice the press conference that happened this morning, when some of the Bangladeshi journalists actually asked the prosecutor, did they actually have printouts of all these email messages and WhatsApp? They actually said no. And their evidence that she was convicted on is apparently the evidence of two witnesses who were apparently in the room when she was having these WhatsApp exchanges with, I think, what is the first secretary, or anyway, a government official in the who is himself charged in this corruption trial. So this is people apparently overhearing a conversation where Tulip herself isn't in the room, which is being taken over electronic methods and then recounting what they say was said. That's evidence that, as the journalists this morning showed, needs to be explored. But of course, Tulip has had no opportunity to do that. This is about the basic principle that a person, which applies in Bangladesh as much as it applies here and applies in all common law countries, and is a universal human right, that a person is innocent until proven guilty and has the right to defend themselves on the basis of knowing what the case is against them. And I should point out as well, of course, there's no suggestion that Tulip herself has had any property out of this transaction.
In the final
year, she's not the only defendant to be convicted of this. Her aunt, her mother, the civil servant, others have also been convicted.
They're going for the whole family, but, you know, under the last few years of Sheikh Hasina and since her fall, Bangladesh has gone through something like a political trauma. It's been very, very painful on all sides. Is your contention that the Bangladeshi court system is inherently flawed and or corrupt, or that in this particular case they have failed?
Well, I know because I myself have actually been in court in Bangladesh back in 2007 or 8, I can't remember exactly when, that the Bangladeshi court, a member of the Commonwealth, operates on the rules that we operate under. So I'm not making any general allegations about the functioning of the courts, but I'm saying in this particular case, which is very much politically motivated, there are reasons for concern that this is not a fair trial. And I haven't even mentioned the fact that the corruption authority that is investigating the matter seems more interested in conducting this case through the media and alleging that Tulip is guilty than it actually is in producing the proof of that fact.
What would you like the British government to do in these circumstances?
Well, certainly, I think that the British government have indicated that there will be no change in Tulip's position. That is, she will remain a member both of the Labour Party and, of course, the serving member of Parliament for Hampstead and Highgate, and that there is no reason to change the view that the British government have already taken about her behaviour, which was decided, was it now a year ago or so?
Outside Bangladesh, you know, she still has parliamentary immunity and nothing changes. I suppose the only thing about this is that if she went back, she could be apprehended and sent to prison for 2 years.
I think that the sadness for Tulip is, of course, that her only relative who remains in Bangladesh is her father, who himself is infirm. He's in a care home. He's been ill for a very, very long time. But I think most of the other members of her family, her aunt and her mother, of course, aren't in Bangladesh anyway. So the likelihood of her going to Bangladesh in the near future is unlikely. And of course, she is, in fact, a British citizen. She was born here. Her husband and her children are here. Her constituents are here. She is, her life is here in the UK.
A final cheeky question, if I may, Cherie. You were back in the day in number 10 when plotters were circling. It's happening again.
Plotters? Surely not, Andrew. Come on. No plots in my husband's time.
No, I'm sure that was the case. Any words of support or commiseration for the current inhabitant?
Listen, being Prime Minister is a hugely difficult job. And I think it's we should all be, as party members, getting behind our government and making sure that we do the right job, the best job for the British people. Let's get on with that rather than fighting among ourselves.
Rally around no plotting. Indeed.
Absolutely.
All right, Cherie Blair, thank you very, very much indeed for talking to LPC tonight.
Take care.
The US Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, is under intense pressure over the allegation that he gave a kill everybody order to the US military for a second strike on a crippled, burning boat carrying drugs in the Caribbean in September. President Trump, who earlier said he wouldn't want a second strike against the two survivors who were clinging to the wreckage, has now backed Hegseth, who said in the statement the strikes were meant to be lethal, destroying narco boats and killing the narco-terrorists who are poisoning the American people. But the United Nations has demanded an inquiry, and senior Republicans in Congress are calling this a war crime. Let's talk to Ambassador John Bolton, National Security Advisor to Donald Trump in his first administration. Ambassador Bolton, thank you very much indeed for joining us. There is always a moment, or there can be a moment, when people go too far when they're going after the bad guys. What do you think about this case?
Well, I think the attacks on the drug boats themselves are part of the confusion surrounding what Trump's objectives are in Venezuela. Does he want to overthrow Maduro? Does he want to stop the drug trafficking? What exactly is he trying to prove here? And we don't know the answer to that. And I think that incoherence in their thinking means there's no strategy, and the attacks on the drug boats are likely primarily to demonstrate that Trump's tough on drugs. We're all against illegal drugs. He's really tough on them. Now, what exactly Hegseth said, and to whom he said it, and how many people he heard what he said, remains unclear. But make no mistake, that is going to be the subject of pretty extraordinary congressional oversight in the very near future.
Absolutely. Because if he did say kill everybody, and two people who were desperately sort of clinging to a burning boat were then blown up or killed by American forces, in many people's eyes, that would be kind of sadistic and going far too far.
Well, as we now know, in the last 3 days of intensive press coverage of what the U.S. Army, U.S. military's own manuals are about dealing with situations like these two survivors, it's pretty clear that they were out of combat and therefore were not legitimately subject to further attack with the use of lethal force. There's a lot of question about the initial attacks on the drug boats and whether they had adequate justification. But I think what's really at stake here is what the iconic French foreign minister, the Marquis de Talleyrand, once said: it's worse than a crime, it's a mistake, because it puts the U.S. in a very, very unpleasant position, again, without knowing what the strategic objective is.
You mentioned the overall objective and the question marks about that when it comes to Venezuela and Maduro. There is meant to be a no-fly zone imposed by the United States over Venezuela. Venezuela clearly thinks that this is close to a declaration of war. How bad are things getting between the two countries, and what do you think President Trump's ultimate aim is?
I don't know what his ultimate aim is, but worse than that, I don't think he knows what his ultimate aim is. The Wall Street Journal made a very good point in an editorial this morning saying Trump provoked this crisis with Maduro, and only one of them will come out a winner. To be clear, I support overthrowing Maduro. I support the use of military force to overthrow Maduro because there are legitimate U.S. national security interests at stake. But having been through the effort in Trump's first term to overthrow Maduro, we owe it to ourselves to succeed this time for U.S. interest and for the people of Venezuela. I don't see evidence that Trump has thought this through. I don't think he knows how to do a strategy to get from point A to point B. And I'm very worried that we've sailed a full carrier strike group across the Atlantic Ocean to the Caribbean without really knowing what to do with it. Maybe we'll find out after tonight, but this is the cart before the horse. You should have the strategy first, then decide how you're going to carry it out.
And in terms of the attacks on the drug boats, the narco boats, I mentioned a couple of Republicans there who've been talking about this as a war crime. Is this further evidence, do you think, this inquiry, of a kind of fracturing or a splintering of Republican support for the president in Congress?
Yes, I think over the past 30 days, starting with some by-elections in early November, you've seen a lot of discontent within the Republican Party. And these two congressional investigations, remember, Congress is under Republican control, House and Senate, but the Republican chairman of the Senate and House Armed Services Committee, respectively, are going to look into this Hegseth order on the second strike. And I will guarantee you those hearings will expand dramatically beyond that limited question, is that the entire Venezuela operation will come under scrutiny, and we'll see how the Trump administration does in explaining what they're doing. Since I don't think they know, I think they'll have a tough time.
Very interesting. A left field question, if you don't mind. My country, Scotland, will be in the United States for the World Cup. We're very excited about it. But there's a couple of examples of other countries, Haiti and Iran, for instance, who are having difficulty getting supporters there and possibly games being moved from one state to another. Do you think the World Cup is safe in Donald Trump's hands?
Well, let me say I'm 80% Scottish, so I wish the Scottish team all the best. This is, again, Trump not thinking through. He wanted the World Cup. He wanted it. Believe me, I've watched this play out beginning in the first term. Now he's got it, and he decides that he didn't fully understand that teams like Iran would show up. There's no excuse to give Haiti any difficulty at all. I think Iran is a different category, but if that's the way the World Cup is played, let some other country host it.
Yeah, and also this business of moving games out of democratic cities and into Republican ones.
Well, this is typical Trump. Everything is about what he wants to do. Norms, conventions, civil society, they don't mean anything to him. I do think this is now increasingly well understood. It helps explain why Trump's popularity is declining.
And, you know, the world spotlight will be on America during the World Cup. Do you think there's a danger that Donald Trump could ruin it?
Well, I think the country will do fine. I think we'll behave and we'll show that we're proper sports fans and all the rest of it. God knows what Trump will do.
Indeed, he probably does. Ambassador Bolton, thank you very much indeed for that. A not so Merry Christmas for patients as resident doctors announce yet more strikes in late December. We'll bring you all the details in just a few minutes. But the time now, 6:48.
See tonight with Andrew Marr.
6:50. The US and UK have signed a deal today exempting us from paying tariffs when buying American pharmaceutical goods. In return, the NHS will pay an increased rates for medicines, which marks the first price rise for the health service in more than 20 years. So, a good deal or a bad one for Britain? William Bain is head of trade policy at the British Chambers of Commerce, and he's here to talk about it. William, thank you very much indeed for coming in. The NHS is going to be paying 25% more for a huge range of drugs, and that's apparently going to cost about $3 billion over 3 years. How could that possibly be a good deal?
Well, if you look about what we're actually trading into the US, last year, our exports of pharmaceuticals were £6.6 billion. This year, it's been over £11 billion because there's been the front loading of trade in anticipation that there were going to be heavy tariffs and pharmaceutical goods coming in. So it's our biggest goods export, nearly a fifth of our goods exports this year in the pharmaceutical sector. So there's a balance to be struck, but it's a really important industry, both in terms of domestic growth and jobs, and especially in terms of exports to the United States. So on balance, it is worth doing this deal.
So companies like GlaxoSmithKline and the other big UK manufacturers will have their future basically secured by the deal, will they?
Well, we've been looking for this for the last 7 months, because what we got at the start of May was a kind of heads of terms agreement. It wasn't legally binding. And we've seen deals being done, with the European Union and the United States, Japan and the United States. Last week, a lot of talk that Switzerland might do a deal with the United States, nailing down their pharmaceutical tariffs at 15%. And the UK would have been left exposed had it not done a deal. Now, I think the sense was it might have been better than 15, but I think a lot of people were very surprised that we've got a zero tariff deal. And that does create a very competitive position for UK pharmaceutical products going into the US. It allows, I think, more inward investment to be won, given that there is tariff-free access to this huge market. And it puts the UK in a pretty decent position for a sector that contributes £42 billion gross value added to the UK economy each year.
It's very rare to bring people some good news about the economy at the moment, so thank you very much indeed for that. The Americans have always said that it was unfair that they weren't able to charge a higher price for the medicines they developed in the United States. Did they have a point?
Well, it's interesting that this deal applies just to new medicines and new authorizations, so it will not apply to those treatments that the NHS is already paying for. But in relation to future medicines, it will bring the UK more into line with the rates that other European countries have been paying for US medicines. So it will not put us above average. In fact, the payments will be still a bit less than France and Germany. So we will not be out of line in terms of other European countries. It will, introduce a little bit more cost into procurement within the health service, and that's always a difficult thing. But it's got to be outweighed by the advantage in terms of investment. You're looking at 126,000 jobs in pharmaceuticals alone in the United Kingdom. And if you take the overall life sciences industry, which pharmaceuticals plays into, you're looking at 300,000 jobs.
It's a lot of jobs. It's a lot of jobs. This seems a kind of a sort of fairly grown-up compromise deal. Wonders will never cease. William, thank you very much indeed for talking to me. Now then, they're at it again. The British Medical Association has announced a fresh round of strikes by resident doctors in the run-up to Christmas. How long for, and what impact should we expect as patients? Zoe Tidman, senior correspondent at the Health Service Journal. Zoe, give us the worst news first. How long and how many different areas of the country are going to be affected?
Hi, Andrew. Thanks for having me on. It is 5 days in the run-up until Christmas that we can expect resident doctors to strike. So it's the 17th of December to the 22nd. And it's not looking good in terms of the disruption for the NHS. Winter, everyone knows, is already such an incredibly challenged time for the NHS. And now you're going to have a reduced workforce of resident doctors make up a huge part of it. So it looks like it's going to be across England, I believe. It looks like for patients.
It looks pretty grim, doesn't it? There had been reports and signs that resident doctors themselves were not nearly as supportive of this strike as they had been of previous strikes, and that more and more of them are choosing to work. Any news on that? Any evidence that that's carrying on?
I'm not sure I've seen evidence of that. I think the decrease in support is really notable among the public, interestingly, as well. So this time last year, it was a lot higher. So I'm not sure about the doctors themselves, but I know the public, it definitely seems like support is dwindling. So it is interesting to see that the run up until Christmas, a fresh round has been announced.
I was listening to Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary, being asked about this recently, and he seemed genuinely, absolutely furious. Have relations between the BMA and the government now pretty much broken down?
I was at that conference last month where I was quite surprised at the rhetoric that he started coming out with, where the row does seem to be becoming increasingly bitter. But there's a lot of name calling on both sides. Wes Streeting was saying some quite harsh words about the BMA at this conference. So it does seem like there is a breakdown of relationships. I guess the fresh round is evidence of that.
And again, I'm relying on reports from other people really on this, but I was told that the previous BMA leadership had been much more radical, much more militant, and that the new leadership was less so. But it seems that the same arguments are going round and round again, and the BMA at that level has not really changed its position at all.
Yeah, certainly not the way Wes Streeton views it. I think he is viewing it as, more of the same. But we're talking about people who are looking for pay restoration here. And there was a 22% increase last year, which I think this is where the support is dwindling, where the BMA clearly feel like they need more. So they're keeping at it. But I think there is that breakdown where they do feel like it is, equally as militant as government would say.
And Zoe, for people listening, can you tell us yet when these strikes actually begin again, specifically, and for how long?
When they begin again, they begin at 7 a.m. on the 17th and finish same time on the 22nd.
So they're going to run all the way up to Christmas. Happy Christmas, BMA. Zoe Tidman, thank you very, very much indeed for talking to LBC tonight. Now, at the start of the programme, I was joined by the Scottish Secretary, Douglas Alexander, and I put to him the charge made by anonymous cabinet ministers they'd been misled by the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, about the size of the black hole in the nation's finances. Here's what he had to say.
Firstly, I don't think it's a good look to anonymously brief journalists. That's your stock in trade, and I understand you welcome that. As a cabinet colleague, I don't think it makes sense. I think it is a sign that they don't recognise their responsibilities. And frankly, in the cabinet, you have the opportunity to put forward your point of view, but you should respect cabinet confidentiality.
One of the most eloquent defenders of the Starmer government out and around at the moment, I have to say, Douglas Alexander. Now, if you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on our free Global Player app or the new LBC app, where you can stay up to date with all the latest news and opinion. You can put your news categories in the order you would like them. You can pause. You can rewind live radio, and you can listen to a range of podcasts. So download the all-new official LBC app free from your app store now. Coming up at 10 on LBC, it's Ben Kentish. But right now, it's time for Ian Dale.